0742 hours, May 27, 1940. Near the French village of Lepinet, Captain Jack Churchill of the Manchester Regiment pressed himself against the cold, damp stones of a crumbling farm wall. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows and ditches of the Pas de Calais, a gray shroud that hid the advancing enemy until they were almost on top of you. He watched 5 gray-green shapes materialize from the fog, moving with the professional caution of the Wehrmacht. Their boots crunched softly on the road. They were 30 yards away now, 33 years old, 14 years a soldier since his graduation from Sandhurst. In this war, 0 confirmed kills. The world around him was disintegrating. Poland had been crushed in 36 days. Now, German panzers were carving through France at 40 miles a day, and the entire British expeditionary force was in headlong retreat towards the Channel coast. Churchill's own company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. Along every road to Dunkirk, it was the same story. Battered German tanks, screaming Stuka dive bombers, shattered communications. A retreat was becoming a rout. Officers burned documents in ditches. Sergeants buried heavy equipment. Private soldiers threw away their rifles just to run faster. But Jack Churchill was not running. Beside him, leaning against the wall, was a 6-foot English longbow, 70 pounds of draw weight, effective range, 200 yards in the hands of an expert. And Churchill was an expert. Just 11 months earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, 26th place out of 63, not a champion, but a master. Good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. The German patrol closed in. He could see the sergeant leading them, a veteran judging by his careful, scanning movements. This man had probably fought through Poland. His eyes tracked across the hedgerow, checked the farmhouse windows, searched for the standard threats, the glint of a rifle barrel, the silhouette of a machine gun nest, the arc of a grenade. He never thought to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill's hand closed around the bow's grip. He knocked a broadhead arrow, the steel tip cold against his finger. He drew the hempstring back to his ear, the yew-wood of the bow creaking under the immense tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor point on his cheek, the same position he had used 10,000 times on practice ranges. He had made this exact shot countless times at straw targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. He exhaled, released. The arrow flew silent and true, a whisper of death in the damp air. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. The other Germans froze, confusion seizing them in the moment before the crack of Enfield rifles from Churchill's men broke the silence. The first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient courage and ancient weapons obsolete. The British Army did not know what to do with Jack Churchill. He had quit the peacetime army in 1936, bored to exhaustion. He'd been a newspaper editor in Nairobi, a film archer and bagpiper in movies like The Thief of Baghdad, a motorcyclist who'd once crashed into a water buffalo on a rural Indian road. When war broke out, he rejoined, but not as a normal officer. He brought his longbow. He brought his Scottish basket-hilted broadsword. He brought a set of Highland bagpipes he taught himself to play in Burma. His superiors saw a liability, a walking anachronism, in a war of 88mm guns and dive bombers. Churchill knew something the tacticians had forgotten. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, psychological warfare mattered as much as firepower. A man charging with a broadsword and a Highland war cry was more terrifying than a man with a rifle. A man who could kill you silently with an arrow possessed an advantage no technology could match. The evacuation from Dunkirk rescued 338,000 men between May 26th and June 4th. Most came home defeated, weaponless, expecting invasion. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his pipes. He had covered his company's retreat. He had killed with weapons from a museum. And he was just getting started. Summer 1940. The British Isles, standing alone. The air smelled of salt, fear, and burning oil from Dunkirk's beaches. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, no relation, demanded a force that could take the fight back to the enemy. The concept was born in desperation. Small, elite units would hit the Nazi-held coastline of Europe, hard, fast, and with maximum violence. They would be called commandos, volunteers only. The training would be brutal, the missions suicidal, the expected casualty rates catastrophic. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. By late 1940, he was at Number 3 Commando, training in the mountains around Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. This was not soldiering as the army knew it. This was ordeal by ice, mud, and live fire. Men marched 30 miles a day with full kit. They scaled cliffs, paddled folding kayaks in freezing locks, and practiced killing silently with knives and garrots. Live ammunition cracked over their heads during assault exercises. Those who couldn't keep up were RTU'd, returned to unit in disgrace. Churchill, at 34, was older than most volunteers. He was also harder, more determined. He could outmarch, outshoot, and outfight men 10 years his junior, and he brought his arsenal. While others zeroed their Thompson submachine guns, Churchill practiced with his longbow, planting arrows in targets at 200 yards. He played his bagpipes, the skirl of "The March of the Cameron Men," echoing off the Ben. He drilled with his broadsword, the blade flashing in the gray Scottish light. The other commandos didn't know what to make of him. Eccentric? Insane? But as training wore on, a grudging understanding formed. Churchill's logic was sound. This new war they were training for wasn't about trench lines or set-piece battles. It was about shock, surprise, and nerve. A German soldier facing a rifle knew the drill. But a German soldier confronted by a screaming madman wielding a medieval broadsword? That would freeze his mind for a critical second. And in close-quarters combat, a second of hesitation was a lifetime. By autumn 1941, Churchill's unorthodox prowess had earned him promotion to second-in-command of Number 3 Commando. The unit had conducted minor raids, probing the Norwegian coast. But now, orders came from Combined Operations Headquarters, a major assault. Target: the German garrison on the island of Volbsøy, Norway. Operation Archery. The strategic stakes were real. Volbsøy controlled fjord approaches. Its town of South Volbsøy housed fish oil factories the Nazis used for glycerin and explosives. The garrison, 150 men, coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries. The plan, a dawn assault on December 27th. Naval bombardment, RAF air cover, then simultaneous commando landings. Churchill studied the maps. He requested, and was granted, command of the first wave against the fortified islet of Malloy, guarding the approach. He also requested permission to carry his sword and play his pipes during the assault. Permission granted with raised eyebrows. On Christmas Day, 1941, they sailed north into the Arctic dark. The temperature plummeted. Ice crusted the decks. Men huddled below, writing letters, checking weapons. Churchill moved among them, a calm, sharpening presence. He had 105 men under his direct command. Their objective: neutralize Malloy's shore battery within 10 minutes of landing. Failure meant the guns would sink the following landing craft. The entire operation hinged on their speed and violence. At 8:45 on December 27th, the landing craft were lowered into the black, freezing water of the fjord. HMS Kenya's 6-inch guns thundered, shelling the coast. RAF Hamptons dropped smoke canisters, shrouding the shoreline in a white haze. Churchill stood in the bow of the lead craft, fully exposed, his bagpipes inflated. The craft pitched in the swell. Through the smoke, the dark shape of Malloy Island resolved. 200 yards, 50, 100. The ramp dropped at 0848 onto a rocky beach. Before his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the knee-deep freezing surf, raised the drones of his bagpipes, and filled the Arctic dawn with the screaming defiant skirl of "The March of the Cameron Men." The sound cut through the boom of naval guns and the rattle of distant small arms. It was absurd. It was glorious. It was psychological warfare at its most pure. The German gunners and their concrete emplacements heard it. What manner of enemy was this? Churchill finished the tune, set his pipes down carefully on the stones, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword, raised it high, and charged up the beach, his voice roaring over the wind. Commando! Behind him, a tide of unleashed fury followed. The assault on Malloy Island was a blur of ice, smoke, and steel. Churchill's charge broke the German defenders' cohesion at the critical moment. Confronted not with a tactical infantry advance, but with a primal, screaming onslaught led by a sword-waving officer, their response faltered. The commandos surged off the beach behind Churchill, Thompson submachine guns chattering, Enfields cracking. They cleared the German positions with ruthless efficiency: bunkers, machine gun nests, observation posts. Churchill was everywhere. He directed squads with sharp gestures of his sword, led the clearing of a trench network, and helped place explosive charges on the 4 captured coastal guns. In under 10 minutes, the battery was destroyed, its crew dead or captured. The islet was secure. The path to the main objective, South Volgzoy, was open, but radio chatter told a different story from the main town. The intelligence had been wrong. The German garrison was larger, reinforced overnight. The commandos attacking South Volgzoy were pinned down in heavy street fighting. Casualties were mounting. The raid was in jeopardy. Churchill didn't hesitate. Gathering his men, he commandeered a landing craft and crossed the narrow strait. He landed on the South Volgzoy waterfront to a scene of chaos. German snipers fired from frozen rooftops. MG-34 machine guns swept the main streets, keeping the commandos trapped behind walls and burned-out vehicles. The air stank of cordite, burning wood, and fish oil from the shattered factories. Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, commanding the main assault, found Churchill. "Jack, we're stuck. We need to break their line on the eastern flank." Churchill nodded, his eyes already scanning the terrain. He deployed his fresh troops and, with a group of men, began working his way down a side street, a narrow, icy alley between wooden warehouses. This was close-quarters work, room by room, house by house. And this was where Churchill medieval arsenal found its second brutal purpose. At a barricaded intersection, a German machine gun team had a lane perfectly enfiladed. 2 commandos had already fallen trying to rush it. Grenades had proven ineffective. Churchill assessed, then moved. He gestured for covering fire. As the Thompsons opened up, he didn't crawl or zigzag. He ran straight down the alleyway, not with a rifle, but with his broadsword held low. To the German gunners, peering over their MG-34's sights, the sight was incomprehensible. A British officer, alone, charging their position with a sword? That split second of confusion, that mental recalibration required to process the image, was all Churchill needed. He closed the distance. The sword, designed for the sweep and cleave of Highland combat, was brutally effective in the confines of the alley. The position fell silent. The story of the madman with the sword spread through the German defenders as quickly as through the British ranks. It sowed a unique kind of fear. By mid-afternoon, South Volgzoy was secured. The fish oil factories blazed, destroyed by demolition charges. Over 100 German prisoners were taken. But victory had a cost. 17 commandos dead, 53 wounded. Churchill emerged without a scratch, his sword notched, his bagpipes intact. Operation Archery was a resounding success. It proved the commando concept, forced Hitler to divert 30,000 troops to fortify the Norwegian coast, and made Mad Jack Churchill a legend within the forces. The War Office stopped questioning his weapons. When he was promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando in 1943, no one batted an eye at his kit list. His next test would be on a larger, hotter stage, the invasion of Sicily. And it was there, in the brutal summer of 1943, that he would engineer one of the most audacious personal feats of the war, the capture of an entire enemy position with little more than sheer bravado and cold steel. July 10, 1943. The coast of Sicily. Operation Husky, the largest amphibious assault in history, was underway. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill led No. 2 Commando ashore at Catania, his broadsword scabbarded at his hip, his longbow across his back, his bagpipes under his arm. His men, now battle-hardened and fiercely loyal, saw not eccentricity but a talisman. If Mad Jack was calm, they could be too. The Sicilian campaign was a grind of heat, dust, and tenacious German rearguards. Churchill's commandos operated ahead of the main advance, a sharp spear point probing for weakness. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies leapt to the Italian mainland at Salerno on September 9th. The intelligence was disastrously wrong again. The Germans were waiting in strength with panzers and artillery. The Salerno beachhead became a killing ground, the entire operation teetering on collapse. Churchill's commandos were given a vital, desperate task: hold the town of Vietri sul Mare, a crucial road and rail junction overlooking the beaches. If the Germans took it, they could rain down artillery on the Allied forces pinned to the shore. For 5 brutal days and nights, No. 2 Commando held Vietri. They fought from shattered buildings, repelled infantry and tank attacks, and called in naval gunfire with grim precision. They held. On the night of September 14th, with the beachhead still fragile, new orders came. German forces had entrenched in the hills above the village of Melina, controlling a pass that led directly down to the Allied lines. An observation post there was, directing devastatingly accurate artillery fire. It had to be eliminated. A direct assault would be suicide. The approaches were bare, covered by overlapping machine gun and mortar fire. Churchill formulated a plan of sublime audacity. He would not attack with his whole force. He would take one man, Corporal David Kirkpatrick, and infiltrate the German lines in the dark. 2 men could move like ghosts, where 200 would be slaughtered. Under a moonless sky, they slipped out of the British perimeter. They became shadows, moving from rock to scrub, drain to ditch, their world reduced to the next few feet of silent ground. They bypassed German sentries so close they could smell the tobacco. They were hunting. Just before dawn, they found their quarry, a German mortar position, dug in on a reverse slope. The crew, 6 men, were relaxed in their pit, brewing coffee, their weapons leaning against the earth wall. They were professionals, vigilant against aircraft, against shelling, against the battalion-level attack. They were not prepared for what emerged from the darkness behind them. Churchill stepped into the faint light of their stove, his figure sudden and impossible. He held his broadsword, not in a dramatic pose, but with the casual readiness of a man who knew how to use it. His other hand held his revolver. He spoke quietly, in clear German. Hände hoch, für Sie ist der Krieg vorbei. Hands up. For you, the war is over. The shock was total. Confronted by this apparition, an enemy officer materializing inside their secure position, armed like a figure from a painting, their will to resist shattered. They surrendered. Churchill used the lanyard from his revolver to bind the first prisoner's hands, then handed the end to Kirkpatrick. Lead on, Corporal. What followed was a cascading feat of psychological dominance. Churchill, with Kirkpatrick herding the growing column of prisoners, moved to the next position. Again, he appeared silently. Again, the sheer incongruity of his presence and his weaponry caused a fatal hesitation. Surrender. Bread surrender. By the time the first rays of sun touched the hills, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill and Corporal David Kirkpatrick were marching back to Allied lines with 42 German prisoners, including an entire mortar squad, plus their weapons. The image was surreal. 2 British soldiers, one with a sword, leading a small company of defeated enemy through the morning mist. Some wounded Germans were placed on carts, pushed by their comrades. Churchill later remarked, it looked like a scene from the Napoleonic Wars. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for gallant and distinguished services in Italy. The citation spoke of his outstanding leadership and personal courage. It did not mention the broadsword. Some truths were too strained for official paperwork. The Salerno beachhead was eventually stabilized, and the long, bloody push north toward Rome began. Churchill fought on, his legend growing on both sides of the line. German soldiers in Italy began hearing whispers of the Schwertoffizier, the sword officer. Some doubted he was real. Others prayed they'd never meet him. By 1944, the Allied High Command had a new use for his unique brand of aggressive warfare. He and No. 2 Commando were transferred to the brutal, chaotic theater of Yugoslavia to support Tito's partisans against the German occupation. It was a landscape of jagged mountains, deep forests, and merciless combat, where prisoners were often a rarity. It was here, on a rocky island in the Adriatic, that the war would finally catch up with Mad Jack. The Adriatic Sea, May 1944. The war in Yugoslavia was a savage, irregular conflict of ambush and reprisal. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, now operating from the island of Vis, threw himself into supporting Tito's partisans with characteristic vigor. He led raids on German coastal outposts, disrupting supply lines and forging a bond of respect with the tough, irregular fighters. The Germans knew a new, aggressive force was at work. They'd heard the stories. The Schwertoffizier was in their sector. In May, Churchill received his most ambitious order yet: lead a force to capture the German-held island of Brock. The island was a strategic linchpin, housing a garrison of over 100 well-entrenched troops with artillery overlooking the crucial shipping lanes. The attacking force was a patchwork: 43 men from No. 43 Commando, Royal Marines, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. The partisans were brave but ill-disciplined. Coordinating a complex amphibious assault with them would be a monumental challenge. The initial landing on the night of May 2nd was unopposed. The Germans, as per their doctrine, had withdrawn from the beaches to fortified positions on the central hills. Churchill's plan was immediate, a swift, coordinated advance under cover of darkness to storm the heights before dawn. But the partisan commanders balked. Seeing the formidable German defenses on the high ground, they refused to move until full daylight. Churchill argued, cajoled, but he could not command them. The element of surprise, that essential ingredient of commando operations, evaporated with the rising sun. The assault, when it finally went in the next morning, was a disaster in the making. Churchill led elements of No. 40 Commando in a direct attack, up a bare, rocky slope toward Hill 622, the key German strongpoint. The partisans, despite their numbers, hung back, offering little support. The commandos were on their own. German machine guns, pre-sighted on every approach, opened up. Mortar rounds began walking up the slope with deadly accuracy. Men fell. The advance slowed, then stalled, the commandos pinned behind rocks, unable to move forward or back. Churchill, understanding that momentum was everything, did the only thing he could think to do. He stood up in the withering fire. He raised his bagpipes to his lips. The first wailing notes of "Will ye no come back again," a haunting Scottish lament, cut through the din of battle. It was not a battle cry, but a dirge, a sound of pure, defiant spirit. He played to give his men heart, to shame the hesitant, to defy the enemy. For a moment, it worked. Men stirred, readying to push again. Then, the German mortars found their range. A salvo of rounds landed directly in the midst of the commandos clustered near Churchill. The explosions were deafening, a storm of shrapnel and rock. When the smoke cleared, every man around him was dead or grievously wounded. Churchill survived only because he had been standing slightly apart, his pipes raised. He was now alone on the hillside, the sole living Briton in his sector, surrounded by the fallen. The German infantry began to advance, picking their way down the slope to finish the job. Ammunition spent, escape impossible, Churchill did not reach for a sidearm. He sat down calmly on a rock amidst the carnage. He picked up his pipes once more, his fingers bloody, and began to play again. The tune was slow, deliberate, a final statement of who he was. The Germans approached, rifles leveled, utterly bewildered. They found not a surrendering officer, but a man making music in the face of annihilation. As they closed in, a German grenade, tossed cautiously, landed nearby and detonated, the concussion knocking Churchill unconscious. He awoke in the back of a German truck, a prisoner. The legend of Mad Jack had been circumscribed by the grim realities of war. He was transported first to Berlin for interrogation. His captors convinced anyone named Churchill must be related to the Prime Minister. Disappointed to find he was not, they processed him as a prized prisoner of war. By August 1944, he found himself in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin, a special compound for prominent prisoners the Nazis thought might be useful as hostages. For most, Sachsenhausen was a death sentence. For Jack Churchill, it was a new problem to be solved. Surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and SS brutality, the man who had stormed beaches with a sword began to plan. His war was not over. It had simply entered a new, more clandestine phase. Escape was not a possibility. It was a duty. Sachsenhausen concentration camp, Oranienburg, Germany. September 1944. The air carried the persistent, sweet-rotten smell of decay and industrial ash. Jack Churchill, now prisoner number 8954, was housed in the Sonderlager, a compound, a section reserved for special prisoners, political figures, abortive Hitler assassins, and high-value POWs like himself. Here, the routine was not the outright extermination of the main camp, but a slower psychological attrition under the watchful eyes of the SS. He was now a prized chess piece in a game that was turning against its players. The Allies were advancing from east and west. The Nazis, growing desperate, began moving their high-value prisoners into a central, mountainous redoubt. Churchill found himself one of 100 prominent prisoners, including former Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg and the family of Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, herded into the Alps in April 1945. The unspoken threat was clear. They were to be hostages, a final bargaining chip, or casualties of a last spiteful act. As the ragged column of prisoners trudged into the Alpine snows, guarded by increasingly nervous SS troops, Churchill watched and waited. The end of the war was a palpable rumor in the air. The question was whether he would live to see it. The Tyrolean Alps, April 1945. The world was collapsing, and Jack Churchill was marching into the heart of its final chaotic spasm. He was part of a ragged column of 140 prominenten, the important, prisoners, being force, marched by their SS guards deeper into the mountain passes near the Italian border. The air was thin and cold, smelling of pine and impending snow. The guards, members of the SS, Totenkopfverbände, were edgy, their authority fraying with every distant rumble of Allied artillery. The prisoners knew the grim calculus. They were hostages, human shields, their value measured only by the desperation of the crumbling Nazi regime. Among them were statesmen, generals, relatives of plotters, and captured Allied officers like Churchill. The plan, hatched in Berlin's final frenzy, was to concentrate them at a hotel in the village of Niederdorf, a bargaining chip for safe passage or a tragic final massacre. For Churchill, every step was an assessment. He noted the dwindling rations, the nervous glances between guards, the whispered arguments among the SS officers. This was not a static camp. It was a volatile, moving situation, and volatile situations offered opportunities. On April 28, 1945, the column reached the Prager Wildsee, a remote alpine lake. The prisoners were crammed into the nearby Hotel Prager Wildsee, their guards digging defensive positions outside. The atmosphere was electric with dread. That evening, a heated argument erupted between the senior SS officer, Sturmbannführer Edgar Stiller, and the army officer nominally in charge of transport, Hauptmann Captain Richard von Alvensleben. Alvensleben, a Prussian aristocrat with a fading sense of military honor, was increasingly disgusted by the SS's intent to use the prisoners as pawns. The prisoners, listening through thin walls, sensed the schism. A delegation, which included Churchill, approached Alvensleben. They spoke bluntly of the war crimes the SS would certainly commit, and of the captain's chance to choose the right side of history. Churchill, the soldier who spoke the language of command and consequence, was a persuasive presence. The standoff that night was tense, silent, and armed. Alvensleben's Wehrmacht soldiers, loyal to him, outnumbered the SS guards. Dawn on April 29th broke over a surreal scene. The SS, under Stiller, realizing their position was untenable, simply withdrew, melting away into the mountains to save themselves. Captain von Alvensleben, in a final act of defiance, declared the prisoners free and abandoned the hotel, leaving them to their own devices in no man's land. They were liberated, yet profoundly stranded. The war was still raging in the valleys below. German units were retreating, partisan bands roamed, and the front was a shifting, chaotic line. Most of the former prisoners decided to wait in the relative safety of the hotel for Allied troops to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had been caged, marched, and used as a commodity. The moment the SS disappeared over the ridge, the commando switch flipped. With his ankle injured from the march, with no food, no weapon, and wearing a tattered mix of uniform and civilian rags, he announced his intention to go toward the fighting, to find the Allied lines. A fellow prisoner, an Italian resistance leader, gave him a crude map and pointed south. The Americans are in Italy, beyond the Brenner Pass, maybe 150 kilometers. Churchill set off alone, a one-man infiltration mission in reverse. He walked for 8 days. He traversed mountain passes still deep in snow, forded icy streams, and skirted villages where die-hard SS or frightened Volkssturm might still be lurking. He lived on raw eggs, stolen from farmyards and melted snow. His journey was a testament to pure, stubborn will. He was not escaping from something anymore, but marching to something, his own side, his own war. On May 8, 1945, emaciated, bearded, and limping, he stumbled into the outskirts of Verona, Italy. Ahead, he saw a column of dust and heard the familiar grumble of diesel engines. Rounding a bend, he came face to face with an advanced reconnaissance unit of the U.S. Fifth Army. The American GIs, seeing a wild-eyed, ragged man approaching, leveled their M1 Garans. Churchill, standing straight, called out in his crispest Sandhurst accent, "Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, 2nd Commando, British Army. Would you be so kind as to tell me where your headquarters is?" The Americans were incredulous. This scarecrow, claiming to be a British colonel, appearing out of the Italian Alps after Germany had just surrendered. He had no identification, no dog tags, nothing. But the authority in his voice, the sheer undeniable force of his presence, convinced them. He was evacuated, debriefed, and put on the first transport back to Britain. He arrived home as a ghost from the past, just as the celebrations of VE Day were fading. The war in Europe was over. But as he stood on English soil, learning of the totality of the victory, a singular, shocking disappointment took root. He had missed the end. There were no more beaches to storm, no more positions to take with his sword. He immediately requested a transfer to the Far East, where the war against Japan raged on. He wanted to lead commandos in the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. He wanted one more battle. The War Office, acknowledging his unique drive, approved. By July 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill was on a troopship heading for Burma, his sword freshly sharpened, his bagpipes packed. He was going to finish his war on his terms. He was, as ever, heading straight toward the sound of the fighting, blissfully unaware that a new age of warfare, one in which there would be no place for a sword charge, was being born in a secret laboratory in the American desert. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, August 1945. The troopship carrying Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill towards a planned invasion of Japan was a floating world of sharpened knives, rehearsed landing drills, and grim anticipation. Churchill studied maps of the Japanese coastline, mentally plotting commando raids. He practiced with his sword on the deck, the sun glinting off the steel. Anachronism pointed toward the fiercest enemy the Allies had yet faced. He was, in his soul, preparing for his greatest and final test. Then the news crackled over the ship's radio, incomprehensible and world-altering. A single American bomber had dropped a new kind of bomb on a city called Hiroshima. 80,000 people dead in an instant. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement echoed through the ship's speakers. The Second World War was over. For the men around him, it was salvation, a reprieve from an invasion predicted to cost 1 million casualties. They cheered, wept, embraced. Churchill stood apart. His reaction, later reported by comrades, was one of bitter professional disappointment. If it wasn't for those damn Yanks and their bombs, he is said to have grumbled, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It was not a lament for lost life, but for lost purpose. The arena in which he excelled, the only context that made complete sense of his unique spirit, had vanished overnight. Peace was a foreign country to Jack Churchill, and he was a terrible tourist. Returned to Britain, his extraordinary service record, DSO and bar, MC and bar, marked him as a hero, but the army had no use for a warrior of his intensity. He was assigned to administrative duties in Burma, overseeing the dissolution of the very empire he had fought to preserve. He found paperwork suffocating, diplomacy baffling. He requested transfers, volunteered for any active posting, but the fires were going out everywhere. The age of the gentleman amateur commando, of solo heroics with personal weapons, was dead, buried beneath the atomic age and the emerging Cold War's impersonal strategic shadow. In 1947, as the British Empire unraveled, he was posted to one of its most violent fault lines, Palestine. As second in command of the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry, he was thrust into the chaos of the end of the British Mandate. Jewish Holocaust survivors fought for a homeland. Arab Palestinians resisted what they saw as colonization. British soldiers, caught in the middle, were targets for both. The violence was intimate, treacherous, a dirty war of ambushes and bombs, utterly unlike the clear lines and pitched battles he knew. He spoke of the war when asked, frankly and without boast, often over a glass of wine in the evening. His son Malcolm recalled that the stories would flow. The arrow at Lepanet, the sword on Vogzoy, the capture of 42 men, the pipes on Brack, the tunnel, the walk. He told them as adventures, not tragedies. He expressed no hatred for the Germans, only a professional respect for a worthy opponent. The medals gathered dust in a drawer. The legend was something that belonged to other people. He was just a soldier who had done his job, in his own way. As the decades passed, the world transformed beyond the frame of his experiences. The Cold War's nuclear stalemate made his kind of hands-on heroism seem like a relic. The empire he'd served was gone. Yet, in the burgeoning special forces communities of the world, the SAS, the SBS, the US, Navy SEALs, His ethos lived on. The emphasis on surprise, psychological dominance, unparalleled fitness, and sheer bloody-minded will were the foundations he had helped pour with No. 3 Commando on those freezing Scottish hills. He watched it all with quiet interest, but his gaze was not backward. He was always looking for the next wave, the next model boat to perfect, the next small adventure in a world that had grown too safe. The warrior's heart beat on, finding its rhythm not in battle, but in the challenge of a river, the precision of a model's rigging, the simple, efficient arc of a briefcase flying true to its mark. March 8, 1996, Surrey, England. The last of the morning mist, so like the fog of that French field in 1940, burned away under a gentle sun. In a quiet room, surrounded by the family he had built in the long, unexpected peace, Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming, Jack Churchill, DSO in Bar, MC in Bar, passed away. He was 89 years old. He had outlived the Nazis, the Empire, the Cold War, and most of the men who had followed him up the beaches of history. The obituaries that followed struggled to contain him. A soldier who fought with a longbow and a sword, they wrote. The last warrior to record a kill with a longbow in combat. The man who went into battle with bagpipes and a claymore. The facts were so outlandish they read like fiction. One newspaper concluded, quite rightly, that if Jack Churchill had not existed, no novelist would dare invent him. But to reduce him to a collection of eccentricities is to miss the man entirely. Jack Churchill was not a relic stubbornly refusing modernity. He was a master tactician of the human spirit. He understood a fundamental truth that gets lost in discussions of tank armor and rate of fire. Warfare is a human endeavor, ruled by fear, confusion, and shock. His longbow was not about nostalgia. It was about silent, unseen killing at a range where a rifle's crack would give away a position. His broadsword was not a museum piece. In the close confines of a Yugoslav alley or an Italian mountain pass, it was a terrifying, intimate weapon that broke an enemy's will before the first blow landed. His bagpipes were not a hobby. They were a psychological instrument of immense power, broadcasting either fearless aggression or unbreakable defiance. He proved that individual courage, properly channeled and utterly unyielding, could bend the battlefields of the machine age. At Salerno, his sword captured 42 men who could have held up a battalion. At Vogzwai, his pipes and his sheer audacity cracked open a fortified island. In Palestine, his smile and his calm evacuated a hospital under siege. His was a methodology of the mind, disguised as medievalism. His true legacy is not in the notched blade on a wall, but in the DNA of special forces worldwide. The commandos he helped forge became the prototype. Their ethos, volunteer only, train harder than the enemy can imagine, think unconventionally, strike with overwhelming violence of action, flows directly into the units that operate in the shadows today. When a modern special operator uses a surprising tactic to achieve a disproportionate psychological effect, he is walking in the footsteps of Mad Jack. And what of the man after the guns fell silent? He showed that a warrior can find peace without disappearing. He surfed river boars, sailed model ships, and threw his briefcase from trains. He lived with a twinkle in his eye, a testament to the fact that the spirit that seeks adventure in war does not die with peace. It simply finds new, quieter rivers to conquer. So remember him not just as the last bowman, or the sword officer, or the piper on the beach. Remember him as the man who looked at the rules of modern warfare and decided to play a different, older game, and won. Remember him as the soldier who proved that in the calculus of combat, the strongest weapon is always an unconquerable heart. His story is not just a tale from a dusty archive. It is a reminder that history is made by individuals, by men and women who refuse to accept the impossible, who charge forward, whether the weapon in their hand is a longbow, a broadsword, or simply an indomitable will.